Hello and welcome to Insight. Today we have with us Mr. Walter Russell Mead, a very special guest because he is one of the foremost thinkers and analysts on foreign policy and Pacific affairs in the world. He is the James Clarke Chace Professor on Foreign Policy and Humanities at Bard College. He previously taught foreign affairs at Yale University. He also writes a regular column for the Wall Street Journal and reviews books for the journal Foreign Affairs. Since 2014, Walter has also been a distinguished fellow at the Hudson Institute. Walter is a highly acclaimed writer with many books to his credit. Please join us today as we discuss the relations between India and the US like they have never been before. Welcome, Walter. It is such an honor for me to have you on Insight with us today. I know, it's been a very busy week for you and you've been up and down across India, but thank you for taking the time out.
Oh, it's always fun to see you, Rami.
Thank you so much. Walter, let me begin by asking you, how was our Prime Minister's visit to US received?
Well, it was a huge success. It really was. I honestly think that it's been a generation since there was an Indian leader who had the kind of visibility and impact that Prime Minister Modi has in the U.S. People who know nothing about India know about Prime Minister Modi, and that's really unusual. I think some of it was actually, of course, because this wasn't his first visit. He's been a number of times. The big Howdy Modi event in Texas caught a lot of people's attention. And then that the U.S. Congress invited him to address a joint session, that there was so much applause. These things, they don't happen every time a foreign leader comes to the United States. So it was a big deal.
Correct. We saw the kind of reception he got. It was next level. Have you ever seen this happen before? And what was the reaction of the American media, the political fraternity? Also, what was the reaction of the general American public?
Okay. Well, actually, let me just start with the government's reaction, because while I sometimes criticize some things about the Biden administration, I thought they got this exactly right. It was absolutely clear from President Biden's reception and everything else that they understand that the U.S.-India partnership is a cornerstone of the international system these days, and that India is, it's a country that needs to be taken seriously, deserves to be taken seriously, and they took it seriously. So you start from that, and that meant that it's not a partisan issue in the United States. George W. Bush, Republican, Barack Obama, Democrat, Donald Trump, a Republican, and now President Biden, a Democrat, have all wanted to strengthen this relationship. So I think this was a true, I don't want to say turning point because we've been moving in the right direction, but a real landmark of achievement.
How do you think, we've crossed this bridge? It's popularly considered that the Indian government has had closer relationships with the conservative parties. But now we see the Biden regime reacting a different way to the Indian government. How do you think this change has happened?
Well, I would say a lot of is driving it is there just a recognition of the importance of India. Because, in America's most important relationships, they really are bipartisan. So, for example, Tony Blair in the UK was Bill Clinton's best friend, and then he was George Bush's best friend. So these really important relationships on both sides, party doesn't matter so much. So, Australia had an election, the Liberals went out and Labor came in, and it didn't really make a difference in the relationship. So what I think this means is that India has become one of those countries where people feel the relationship is too big to fail. Now that said, it's probably likely that Democrats and, say, people from the Congress, National Congress here, Indian National Congress, would have an easier time, sort of would relax a little bit more around each other, while Republicans and BJP people would be a little more relaxed in each other's presence. But everybody understands this is a relationship that needs to work.
Why would you say everybody understands now and they didn't before? Is it because of US viewing India from the lens of what it sees China doing, or is it an independent relationship?
Well, I think there's several. Whenever you see a big change in international relations, there are usually several factors at work. I'd say one thing, both in India and the US, is a country that used to divide us, Pakistan, doesn't divide us anymore. Pakistan has now turned to China. The US-Pakistan relationship is not a significant relationship, and we're both concerned about some of the things that we see there. And at the same time, you could say that as Russia has drawn closer to China, India has been thinking a little bit more about how reliable is Russia as a friend. And if if China, Russia, and Pakistan are all going to be sort of on one side, well, then India has to think pretty hard. So some of the issues that used to divide us in the past just don't divide us anymore. More than that, though, I think we both see enormous economic opportunities. The rise of the Indian economy, the infrastructure development, which hopefully will sort of propel a new generation of investment, the need of many companies to diversify their supply lines, their supply chains, so they're not so vulnerable to Chinese pressure or to political upheavals. All of these things are making American business also take another look at India, and for that matter, Indian business to take another look at the U.S.
Absolutely. Do you think that, the meeting also spoke about defense deals and manufacturing? What is your takeaway from that? Do you think that is really reflective of the trust that's growing between the two countries?
Absolutely. I think the decision to allow jet engines to be made in India was not something the U.S. would do lightly. Those are some very important and sensitive technologies, so that level of technology sharing is really quite significant. I guess what I hope we're going to see more of, and it's not that it was people decided against it or anything at this summit, but I think when I look at the Indian economy and at the U.S.-India relationship, I feel India could be doing so much more as a manufacturing export platform in the world. And we ask what made China grow so explosively for so long. It was manufacturing for export was the engine that drove it all. You look at the rise of Japan, of Taiwan, of South Korea, of Singapore. For all of them, manufacturing played a huge role. Now, India has done something very unique and individual with its tech sector, which is really remarkable. But that is not, tech alone, important as it is not an engine that's going to create millions of jobs, and especially maybe for Indians who don't speak English or other foreign languages, who have fewer educational credentials. But these are the people who need new opportunities and jobs. So I really hope that in the next step of the U.S.-India relationship, we can all be looking at ways that more foreign investment can come to India in order to create a vibrant manufacturing sector that reduces the world's dependence on China and creates millions of jobs, or maybe should I say crores of jobs.
This is what we hope in India as well, that we can become a manufacturing hub, giving employability to the kind of trained expertise that we already have in India. But you are such a specialist on foreign policy, so could you tell me the nuances of the changing foreign policy in the last 9 years of India on the US and vice versa? What has changed? What needs to change?
All right. Well, I think one of the biggest things that's changed on the Indian side is a new self-confidence. I can remember when I first would come to India 20, 25 years ago, or however long ago it was, you often found a sense among Indians that somehow the world was taking advantage of India, and that if there were real competition, the Indian would not be allowed to succeed. And one can certainly understand the colonial history behind that and the other problems. But what's happened, I think, increasingly because of the success of the tech sector and economic growth, reductions in poverty, there's a much more self-confident attitude in India. And when you're dealing with a country like the United States, that makes the relationship much easier when Indians perceive it as a relationship of equals, and increasingly Americans do. That's a very different place from where we were. So that's one thing. I do think the fact that we're both worried about China has created some changed perceptions in both countries. And while the United States may think mostly about Taiwan and the East China Sea and that region, and India is looking at the Himalayas, the Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean is making us all think as well. And we see what they did to Sri Lanka by basically a colonial seizure of a port, practically. And that's, we see Chinese political intrigues in small countries in the Indian Ocean.
States?
Exactly. That are a problem for both of us. Or a base being constructed in Cambodia. This is, so that Xi Jinping is the great unifier in a way. He is bringing the United States and India closer together. And I've written about this in the Wall Street Journal, in my column there, that when I look at, I ask, why does America have a problem with China? It seems to be that China, unfortunately, thinks that it has an opportunity to establish itself as kind of the hegemonic power in Asia, and that China can determine the future shape of the region. And it's a little bit like Japan in the 1930s, where they also had this idea, we are the most industrialized country, the richest country in Asia, here is our opportunity. And so now we've got to, we've got to think about how do we persuade the Chinese to take a different path, and certainly preferably without war. So every time I hear people talk about war between the U.S. and China, I say, no, that would be the worst disaster, absolutely catastrophic. The goal is to find a peaceful path through all of this. Now that means we have to be militarily prepared so that people in China don't get ideas. But our goal should never be to provoke or launch any kind of hostilities. But here's the thing. The only reason China thinks that it has the chance to become a dominant Asian power is because it stole a march on India in economic development. That is, in 1980, the Indian economy was about 65% the size of the Chinese economy. And today it's about 17% of China's economy. And that gap, losing almost 50 points, that gap is what has created a regional imbalance. If India's economy today, about $10 trillion or so, China would look at Asia and say, you know what, we can't possibly dominate Asia. It's too big, it's too rich. India is too much of a presence. Too many countries are looking to India. And China would begin to, at that point, would begin to see its own best interest is to work with its neighbors, work with India, and think as a group about where Asia should go. And so from the American point of view, promoting economic growth in India isn't just an economic thing. Hey, our businesses can make money and that would be nice. But actually, it's a national security issue for us.
That was actually my next question, but you've already answered it. Yes, please continue.
Yeah, India's economic success is in the national security interest of the United States. That, I think, is a fundamental and really important point. And I think I don't think we've yet thought through all of the implications of this. And I certainly don't think we've yet developed all the policies that such a perception would require. And that's what I hope when we think about where does the U.S.-India relationship go now. Prime Minister Modi has made his speech. India has arrived. Okay, what now? And it strikes me that working to develop the economic success of India needs to be kind of a central issue now.
But how would you then explain, and this is for argument's sake, India is a democratic country, China isn't, that makes certain things far easier for China to do. So how does one counter that then?
Well, I think, it does take time. And this is where I look at something like the RSS as a social movement that sort of has understood that if India is to be truly successful, Indian society has to be strong, confident, and have an outlook based in its own history and traditions that enables it to be open to the future, inventive and creative, and even to make certain changes that will enable India to flourish. I look at Japan, say, in the 19th century, the 1800s, when all of a sudden Commodore Perry from the United States appears with this massive naval ships with cannons that they don't have anything like that in Japan. And the Japanese say, oh my goodness, if we don't do something, we're going to be a colony. Yeah. So the Japanese in the Meiji Restoration, they pulled it together, and in 30 years, they had the economic and the technological power that enabled them to stand at the front rank of world powers. In some ways, this is almost a Meiji moment for India, because China has now grown to the point, and its ambitions have grown to the point, where India, for India's own sake, needs to speed up the pace. And that will require some economic policy changes. I mean, if everything were fine, India would be keeping pace would have kept pace with China. It hasn't, so something has to change. Several things have to change. And a lot of that is going to involve what can make India a destination for foreign investment that will power the growth. Now, there's a lot of investment in India, and that's great. So India is not a beggar going around the world holding out a tin cup. But foreign investment is critical to sort of turbocharging India's economic development. And clearly, the opportunity now is, because people want to move away from China, they need to go somewhere. There's a lot of investment looking for a home. Right now, too much of it maybe is going to Vietnam or to Thailand. And India is still not getting its fair, full share. When I look at Europe, for example, India is a much better place for manufacturing for Europe. Because if you compare it to Vietnam or China, first of all, the oil from the Middle East has a shorter trip to India than it does to China. So that should make things cheaper, reduce costs. And at the same time, once you've manufactured the goods, they have a shorter trip to Europe. So India has natural advantages as a manufacturing hub. But Indian policies haven't yet found the way to fully capitalize on what those advantages could yield. And some of them that you hear about have to do with, in China, basically the local government can just say, fine, everybody who lives on these 500 acres, go away, and signs a contract with the foreigners. And India doesn't operate that way and shouldn't operate that way. But somehow there sort of needs to be, I don't know, maybe it's a vehicle where the claims and the complexities, and there's a national authority that takes the claims so that the foreign investor can have the investment and be secure, but everyone gets fair compensation. And if it's a matter for courts, well, it can take time. No one should lose their rights, but there should be a way that a foreign investor can make a move and be confident that it will happen. A lot of it is about investment in infrastructure, and clearly the current government has stepped that up massively. I think maybe some more work, I'm told, could be done in the ports, but the works on the highways and the rail and the electricity have been really stupendous. In fact, it used to be when I came to India, I couldn't get anywhere quickly because the roads were so bad. Now I can't get anywhere quickly because there's so much construction. And that's definitely better. That's definitely better. So those things, I think there are, the thing to do really is to talk to the investors and find out, what do you want? I think there's a little bit, one has this tendency, maybe especially in a bureaucracy, a group of people get together and come up with plans for what they think the investors ought to want, right?
Not what they actually want.
Yes, exactly. And you will never know what they want unless you talk to them. And so figuring out, and again, right now India is looking, I think, mostly at very large companies like Apple. And it's terrific. If they move in, that's great. But a lot of manufacturing is done by middle-sized and smaller enterprises. And those, if you're a big, well-capitalized, multinational firm, you're very good at making investments, and you do a lot of it, and you know what to do. And if there are problems, you have a whole legal team, and you have all of these things that can work with them. If you're a smaller company, you have to be more cautious. And so India needs to think, how do we become a place that the German Mittelstand, that the American middle-sized and smaller manufacturer, that for that matter the Korean or the Brazilian entrepreneur who may not represent a multinational, can really come and be very comfortable and very successful?
By what you've said, I have two questions that come to mind. So let me push you a little bit here. You said, of course, conducive environment, learning what, an investor wants. We've already made good infrastructural changes. Mm-hmm. But over and beyond that, there's also this perception of India that sometimes seems to hinder this sort of engagement. What, in your opinion, is that?
Well, I think there's been historically this sense of, people called it the license Raj. And there was the reputation that for many years India was pursuing a more socialist planned economy. So there was a suspicion of business, maybe. And the license Raj, the bureaucrats were delighted in discovering a new obstacle or a tiny little subparagraph in the regulation, and you have to stop. And it was enormously frustrating. And I think you can also say that perhaps some civil servants were not above occasionally having their hand out and saying, right. And that, by the way, for many foreign companies is a big problem, because they have, under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the United States, for example, bribing a foreign official is actually a crime for an American company at home, regardless of what it may be in that company. And we have auditors and lawyers and so on who are constantly looking at these things. And the beauty, if you want to call it that, of the Chinese system is we all know China is a pretty corrupt country. Even the Communist Party is constantly arresting half of its members for being corrupt and having these big trials. There's a lot of corruption in China. But if you're a foreign investor in China, you don't see it necessarily because it's very central. You pay, the local government tells you, this is how much your thing will cost. You pay them the check. Now, they have bribed, perhaps, and manipulated and done all kinds of dirty things, but to you, it's a very clean and simple transaction, right? So China found a way to make it look simpler than it is, really, for foreigners. And again, the foreign investor can say, what corrupt practice? I signed an agreement with the legally authorized local governments. Now, what they did with the money, I don't know. They didn't tell me, and it's none of my business, right? So, in that sense, trying to figure out a way in which, well, India is one of the culturally richest and politically and culturally most complex societies on earth, which I actually, from the standpoint of someone who loves to come to India, eat Indian food, meet Indian people, I love this.
Yeah, and you've traveled for years and years.
Yes, right, and I'm still, every time I come, I see new things, and this was my first visit to Rajasthan, and I can't believe I haven't been there before.
You know, it's funny you say that because when I go to the Northeast, I say this to myself, that every time I come here, and I've been coming here for like 15 years, I learn something new.
Yes, exactly.
So just imagine you come from America to India and then the nuance of it all.
Sometimes I feel I need to rest for a week when I go home just to process everything that I've learned. So this is fantastic, but at the same time, from the standpoint of a small company, trying to invest.
Yeah, it can be overwhelming.
Exactly. I mean, I'm glad in a way that a lot of the authority in India is delegated to the states for some of these, because it's possible, we all know that Gujarat, has made itself very successful in this way, and other states can learn, and it's simpler sometimes for a company to be dealing with a state. Uttar Pradesh, I gather, is really trying to sort of open itself up for more investment. Obviously, in Bangalore, we see, Karnataka has clearly built relationships. So Indian states can do it. And that I think is helpful.
I think you're right. But, when we talk about also perception of India, we look at China in comparison to China. India is still less complex in the sense that, English is prevalent and, language is not a barrier like it would be in China. So I'd expect China to be more overwhelming. Yet China, for whatever reason, seems to be a larger trade partner with most countries. My question then is, we also tend to look at a lot of the countries from the West viewpoint in terms of human rights. Mm-hmm. When it comes to China, there doesn't seem to be a problem. When it comes to India, there seems to be this lens.
Well, I think we have to say first, the worst day India has in human rights is better than the best day China has, right? And every serious person knows this. That's not a controversial statement. India clearly, not only the whole society in India has democratic aspirations, and every now and then things fall short. Well, that's the way human society works, and it's also sometimes a function of economics. And India,
a large population.
Yeah, so of course, but obviously China is grounded on an entirely different principle of the supremacy of an unelected, unaccountable authority is the best way for things to work. And now in a really terrifying way, they have combined the power of technology and the universal surveillance, the constant omnipresence. I mean, we worry sometimes about what Google or Facebook or some of these private companies know about us and so on. But what if the government has everything and is using that intentionally to police everyone? That's what we have in China. So that is, but at the same time, of course, China's repression in a way is often not news because it's so institutionalized, it's normal, right? So if you're reading the news from China, usually, Tuesday it's not entire state founded on repression is not the headline story, right? Yeah. But in India, when you have something like you had in Manipur with the really tragic riots and communal violence, it's a big story. And it has the ability to be a big story more than once to kind of, and every time something happens, it's a story. So somebody might think, well, boy, China is this calm, peaceful country, and India is just this confusing mess. Yeah. And that's true, but there's the only way to counter that in terms of investors is that investors need to be to learn through experience that India works. That this is what I've learned. Every time I come to India, I learn something. I understand the world better. I have a good time. Even though things are sometimes confusing, it works out. So I have a comfort level now that I didn't have when I first started coming. Well, investors have to develop that.
Correct. And you brought this point out earlier as well, that and we saw it during the Prime Minister's visit, that big tech companies like Google and Microsoft were very enthusiastic to welcome him. And as you mentioned, that it's the small tech companies that also need that leverage. What was the reaction of small tech companies? Were they even a part of this engagement that happened in the US, or they're completely ignored at this point?
Well, if you're running a startup, you're only thinking about your startup. That's all consuming. And so you don't sit around thinking about big issues of the day. So I would have to say that for small tech firms that are really focused on their local business, they're thinking less about these things. And what needs to happen is that I think India needs to think about how does one reach out. I mean, I was at the World Economic Forum in Davos last year, and everywhere you turned there was a pavilion from a different Indian state. Now I have to say, from my point of view, that was excellent. Oh, look, food from here and food from there. I could walk up and down the Swiss city sampling Indian dishes. I was quite happy to do it. But there aren't many small companies who go to the World Economic Forum. That's a very expensive place. That's where the big firms go. So, there's cities in the United States like Dallas and Austin and Texas that are not Silicon Valley. Right, but also a lot of the businesses, they may use tech. Every manufacturer uses tech to some degree, but they don't think of themselves necessarily as a tech business. But India's tech capabilities would make it a very good platform for their business. So some of these places are in Ohio, they're in the Rust Belt, as we say, and we don't say, they don't look like glamorous industries, glamorous tech industries, but in reality, every industry is a tech industry these days. So I think Indian efforts to attract investment should probably widen out and go regional and get into the States. Here, by the way, India really does have a secret weapon, and that's the diaspora. Right. That a lot of Indian Americans are working in small companies, in startups, but are also living in all of these areas. They have social networks. And so if you have an Indian delegation coming from a particular state or something, they would be able to use that diaspora group as a point of contact and help them begin to establish the connections they need. So this is something I think you can do as well, and many countries don't have that advantage.
Absolutely, I think that's a great point, Walter, because when the Prime Minister walked into the Senate, we saw a lot of people trying to take photographs of him, and clearly there is an influence of the Indian diaspora amongst the politicians, the government. They realize the importance of it. So yes, leveraging that would be very important. Let me come to my last question, Walter. Well, my second last question. I want to come back to when we were talking about China and Chinese revisionism and how that should be a point of convergence for us. How do you see the Quad playing a role?
I think the Quad is absolutely critical. You know, one of the things that's interesting to me is that all four of these countries have good relations with each other, had them before the Quad, independent of the Quad. So you talk to people in Australia about India, or in India about Australia, you'll often hear a kind of natural affection, and we can get along with these people. Same thing, Japan and India. In Japan, you hear people talk about thousands of years of cultural connections. So, you know, the Quad is strong because every single one of the countries in the Quad has ties with all of the other countries, and we have this central concern about maintaining the peace and security of Asia without accepting that China gets to write all the rules.
Absolutely. The rule of law on the Indo-Pacific is hugely important and common to all of us, especially in light of what is happening in the Solomon Islands or Coco Islands, so on and so forth.
Exactly. By the way, one thing I've noticed sometimes in India is that people say, oh, Taiwan is very far away, and so what happens in Taiwan is not so important to India. I think it's worth thinking about what would happen if China did attack Taiwan, right? The economic consequences of that, where like there would suddenly be no trade in and out by sea, in and out of China, the US and Japan. There would be, not only would there be a blockade, but when there's a war, commercial shipping doesn't like to travel in a war zone. Yeah. So what does that do to supply chains in India? What does that do? You know, think of the war between Russia and Ukraine has affected many other countries, but it is nothing compared to what a war over Taiwan would be or what it would mean. It would be, I think, the greatest shock to the Indian economy since independence. And not obviously just to the Indian economy. So India has a major national interest in what happens in and around Taiwan, apart from any military thing. And the question for India, among other things, is how do we make sure that we have a seat at the table so that when the Americans are thinking about sanctions on China after an attack, India is listened to? But more importantly than anything, how does India help prevent that from happening in the first place? Because we've all seen from the war in Ukraine, regardless of what you think about the war, it would have been so much better if the war hadn't happened. No one has benefited from this war. No one will benefit.
Don't.
No. And the war creates new problems every day. So it's so much better to think about how do you prevent a war. So what is the role, what roles can India play in maintaining peace in a place that is not right on India's, right in its region, but which has an enormous impact on India's interests?
Wonderful. Walter, you've left us with some really fundamental questions that we need to think about and answer. So let me come to my final question. Is how do you see the India-US relationship in the future developing?
Well, on the positive side, I do think in both parties in the United States, there's a pretty strong understanding of the importance. And if we look, when Donald Trump was president of the United States, U.S.-Indian relationships stayed on a very even keel. So the Europeans think, well, if Donald Trump is elected as the end of the world, it's clearly not the end of the world for the Indian-U.S. relationship. So that is good news. I do think there are some warning signs, though, that we have to pay attention to. In the past, the U.S. and India have had moments of closeness and then misunderstandings or other things, and we became estranged. So we both need to think about, we don't want to repeat that pattern, so how do we avoid it? And I have noticed, I mean, in the middle of all the celebrations, there were something like 75 members of Congress who boycotted the Prime Minister's speech. As it happened, those were all on the left, I think, in the so-called progressive caucus of the Democratic Party. Well, the party has drifted somewhat to the left over the years. And so if that continues to grow, I could see that as a problem. If India becomes targeted, increasingly targeted for human rights issues or things like that, we see, for example, right now there's a Senator Menendez is blocking the sale of F-16s to Turkey. So we see even sometimes only one senator who is, has strong backing from some kind of social base can really disrupt presidential decisions and policy making. So you can't sleep in politics here, and you have to be thinking, how do I build connections? How do I build allies? How do I increase an understanding of problems in India? How maybe there are some things I can do in India that would make these problems less dramatic or something. I don't know, but there are a whole lot. One has to be thinking of this. I would say that, having had the opportunity to get to know your ambassador in Washington, and for that matter, Mr. Jaishankar, who I think is really a world-class diplomat and intellect, I see that many intelligent people in India are thinking about this, and I would just encourage them to keep thinking. And then on the U.S. side, it's so easy for Americans to sort of assume that we have the answers, and we don't. There are a lot of. If the people of India came to me and say, please take the imperial crown and rule India, I wouldn't know what to do. I cannot tell you what to do because I don't know what you should do. But people who know nothing about India find it very easy to say, who know even less than I do about India, find it very easy to say, well, you should do this and you should not do that.
We'll have to agree with you, Walter. Sometimes it surprises us, the commentary that comes on some of the most complex issues like Manipur. It surprised the country.
Yeah, right. You get, the less you know, the easier it is to take a very simplistic approach. So I look at where the U.S. has had long-term close relations with countries. People who aren't involved in foreign policy can think, oh, well, that's just natural. The U.S. and Germany have always been friends. Well, we haven't been. We had World War I and World War II. And after World War II, with the Cold War, Americans and Germans said, okay, we cannot do this again. This is just a disaster. And so we need to make sure that the younger generation of Americans and the younger generations of Germans are getting to know each other, that our elites, that our media people, that our opinion leaders know each other. And so there's a whole range of programs. Some are government-sponsored, but some are in the private sector and the nonprofit sector. And some are sort of university-to-university arrangements and things like this that have built up over decades a very, very thick web of connections. And so it seems to me that the U.S. and India, this is one of the things we now need to do if we want our relationship to put down roots and become really sturdy, is that we need to be developing that infrastructure. So, and it's harder because, you know, U.S. and Germany are closer than the U.S. and India. You've been to the U.S. and you know it's a long trip, and it also costs money. So we have to think, how do we bring young American thought leaders to India, where not just like, oh look, the Taj Mahal, oh, an elephant, but to learn and to engage and meet people who live here who think, right? And then the same Indians coming to the U.S. We have to think about, how do we do this?
Absolutely necessary, Walter, a multi-level engagement, and a continuous one at that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Walter. It was such an honor to have you with me on Insight, and I really hope to have you again.
Great. Well, it's good to see you always, Rami.
Thank you so much, Walter. That was my friend, Walter Russell Mead, at his eloquent best. As Walter says, India and US relations have gone strength to strength. It was evident with the Prime Minister Modi's visit to the US earlier this month. Yet, there is much to look forward to and much to be achieved. But with friends of India like Walter Russell Mead, I think our paths are clear. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time.